Hello, everyone. My name is Russ Cohen, and I am fortunate to serve as a volunteer for the Protect Us Kids organization. I would like to welcome you to our inaugural Protect Us Kids virtual conference. And I'm also fortunate to introduce to you our next speaker, Steve Crump. Steve is a global health and development professional with extensive experience in international organizations, such as the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. He also consulted for organizations like the START Network and Babylon Health. As a former trustee of the Child War UK and MICAIA, Steve has dedicated his career to addressing global injustices, particularly in supporting marginalized communities. Profoundly deaf, Steve founded DeafKidz, DeafKidz International, in response to the abuse of deaf children in sub-Saharan Africa. His organization is now a global leader in safeguarding deaf children, recognized for its rapid growth and impact. Welcome, Steve, and thank you.
Hello, welcome. My name, Steve Crump. I'm the founder and the chair of DeafKidz International. Over the next 50 minutes, we're going to look at the risk, the susceptibility of deaf children to abuse online. Why are they at risk? Why are they vulnerable? And what are you, as part of the global child protection community, going to do about it? This is a session where I'll be asking questions and I'll be looking for you to feedback, because it is only together that we can make a difference. It is only together that we can ensure deaf children are protected online. First of all, we're going to look at disability as a whole and the incidence of disability, the numbers globally, because that will show us we as a movement have to do something. Then we'll look specifically at the needs of deaf children, and then we'll look at what you need to do as a global movement, Protect Us Kids, its partners, and more. And hopefully at the end of the session, we'll be able to think about how we ensure our work is inclusive of the needs of children that are most at risk. If you need the captions, hopefully you've switched them on. I've been using British Sign Language to demonstrate to you sign language, and that many deaf children communicate in sign language. Do you know how to access sign language communicators? Do you know how to book interpreters? More and such like we will look at during the course of this session. What I'm going to do now is share my screen, and then I'll take you through the presentation. And remember, many questions asked, because it's only by asking questions that we can develop awareness, we can develop understanding, and collectively work together. Thank you. So, as mentioned first, let's have a look at the global incidence of disability and what are the numbers out there, and therefore how do we need to shape our programming in responding to the needs of the most vulnerable to online abuse. 15% of the global population experiences some form of disability, and that number is usually cited for the developed world. This number rises to 20% in low-resource settings, where perhaps healthcare provision is not so good and where there's a greater incidence of disability because of ill health, susceptibility to infections, genetic conditions, and more. Disability is essentially the dynamic interaction between health conditions and contextual factors, where you're living, how you're living, your personal circumstances, your environment. For example, you know, your bodily functioning conditions, for example, blindness, perhaps a learning disability, or such like. Activity limitations, which perhaps can limit your ability to walk, to eat, to move around, or such like. And finally, participative restrictions, which means you are challenged or you have problems, for example, in accessing employment, in transportation, in being part of civil society, engaging, involving, and so on. So all three of those factors, conditions, activity limitations, and participative restrictions lead to sort of a perfect storm that creates a challenge for disabled children and young people. And it's that interaction which affects, for all intents and purposes, the life, the well-being and the ways of living for that young person. So, having looked at the factors that can lead to disability, what examples do we have? Blindness, obviously, and sight loss, deafness and hearing loss, learning disabilities, mental health disabilities, um, including depression there. Depression is perhaps the largest disability globally after sight loss and then followed by deafness. Neurological disabilities such as cerebral palsy, physical disabilities, motor and such like, and lastly, autism. So those are examples of disability. And certainly if you're talking about disability, it's quite important to get the language right. We don't say hearing impaired. Am I impaired? I'm profoundly deaf. But am I impaired? No. We say deafness, we say hearing loss. We don't say that person, something wrong with them, or they're a bit simple. We say they have mental health disabilities. And there's some derogatory terms for autism. We say autism. So that the accepted language in terms of the disability space. Now, having talked about the incidence of disability, 15% of the global population in the developed world, 20% in less resource settings, and having just described some types of disability, what are the models of disability? It's essentially four models that are talked about in the disability space. There's the charity model, which says, you know, children with disabilities are to be pitied. They're a victim. Oh dear, how sad, that's shame. Then there's the medical model of disability, which says disability is a medical condition. You're not able to move around, you have a motor disability, you're in a wheelchair, we'll fix it. And then there's a social model of disability, which says you're disabled because you're not able to access civil society. You're not able to get on the train and go to work. You're not able to go to school and participate in lessons because you can't see what is being taught. So, you know, a lack of access, a lack of wherewithal, a lack of facilitation. So the social model of disability. And then there's lastly the rights model of disability, which is actually saying that all children have a right to be included. And if you draw a reference from the United Nations Convention of the Rights of People with Disability, it's very clear in that statute that children, disabled children, have a right to be included in education, in safeguarding, in access to health, in access to food provision, and so on. So there's four models of disability, and certainly within DeafKidz, we subscribe to the social model that actually there are barriers within civil society, which means that that deaf child is not able to access health, protection, education, and as they get older, employment. So, perceptions of disability vary, and clearly these have a particular impact upon the abuse and exploitation of deaf children. So let's just have a look at that, why those perceptions are influential. Perceptions of disability may be positive or negative. Invariably, they are negative, certainly in our experience, and they focus on the difference. There's something wrong with that child. They don't understand what I'm saying. They're deaf and they're dumb. A derogatory term, deaf and dumb, we don't say. Oh, that child is simple. They've got something wrong with them. They can't understand what I'm doing. They must be mental. They're simple. So often negative attitudes will focus on difference. In some cultures, there's a shame and embarrassment. The child is disabled because of something they did in a former life or something that the family has done. And that disabled child is an embarrassment, it's a shame to us. And certainly in some of the geographies DeafKidz has worked in, we have seen deaf children hidden. They don't engage with the family, they're pushed away. They are in the back room, an embarrassment, never to be seen, and never to be included. And of course, what we've seen as well is that some deaf and disabled children are seen as worthless, denied access to communication, education, and health. You're worthless. You're an economic burden. And over and above that, we're ashamed of you. We're embarrassed of you. And so therefore, they're not afforded any opportunities as might other children within the family. And then, of course, because these deaf children are seen as worthless, they're subjected to abuse and exploitation. You're an economic burden, you're worthless, it doesn't matter, so I'm going to push you onto the street to sex work, or I'm going to beat you up, and because that's my venting my frustration, because you're an embarrassment to me, you're worthless. Or within the community, that child is subject to abuse, sexual, physical, emotional neglect, but it's okay. It doesn't matter. That child is worthless. So perceptions of disability can vary, but invariably they're negative. So what we've done there is just looked at the global incidence of disability. And that figure of 15% comes from the World Health Organization. In developed settings, and the figure of 20% again from the WHO in low resource. So immediately what that is telling us today at this conference is that in our work, 15% potentially of the children that we're looking to support, empower, resource and protect have some form of disability, perhaps from slight to profound and across that spectrum just outlined. It could be blindness in sight loss, deafness in hearing loss, a learning disability or such like. So that immediately says to you and to I, how do we shape our programming? How can we ensure that our program is inclusive of these groups? So having set the scene by looking at the global incidence of disability, types of disability, perception, so on, let's look specifically now at deafness. Deafness is the third largest disability globally. Remember, I was saying that depression is the largest disabling condition globally, followed by sight loss, and thereafter deafness. And yet it is the least resourced and the least understood because it's invisible. And certainly from work that DeafKidz has undertaken in low resource settings in sub-Saharan Africa, in India, Pakistan, South Asia, we found that as many 2 in 10 children experience some form of hearing loss, from slight temporary hearing loss as a result of an infection or such like, through to profound, where there is no hearing and no ability to access, acquire sound. Now, this high incidence is invariably due to poor maternal health, poor neonatal care, and certainly during the in terms of the maternal cycle, the eardrums are the last part of the fetus to form, one of the last parts of the fetus to form. So clearly, if maternal health is not good, if there's not good nutrients, then there's a risk there that the inner ear will not form properly, and therefore there's a likelihood of deafness occurring. Similarly, with neonatal care, there can be a susceptibility to conditions that can cause deafness, such as meningitis, scarlet fever, and more. Furthermore, I should add, we've seen instances of deafness caused by birth trauma or infection, as mentioned earlier. And the challenge with these infections, with perhaps an ear infection, is that they don't get treated. And so what becomes temporary deafness actually becomes permanent. So, the 3rd largest disability globally, as many as 2 in 10 have, in low resource settings, experienced some form of deafness. And of course, the challenge there is that screening programs that detect childhood deafness are few and far between. So in many cases, the deafness is undiagnosed, is unrecognized, and that leads to this challenge or this perception that there's something wrong with the child, they're stupid or they're retarded, as opposed to actually being deaf. And in fact, if the infection had been treated or an early intervention had taken place in terms of communication support, then that child would be able to be, well, certainly if the infection had been addressed here, if communication of support's affected, at least be able to communicate and be part of what's going on around them. So the experience of deaf children. DeafKidz International, the global leader for the protection and safeguarding of deaf children. In our work, we have found that deaf children experience endemic stigma, discrimination, abuse, and exploitation. As I've just said, there's something wrong with that kid. It doesn't matter if I hit it. It doesn't matter if I neglect it. It doesn't matter if I sexually abuse it, because they don't know. They don't matter. Nobody cares. Our evidence, our documented evidence, is that 1 in 4 deaf girls experiences sexual abuse, including online sexual abuse and exploitation. And deaf girls are more likely to be sexually abused than hearing girls, 4 times more likely to be sexually abused than hearing girls. In many cases, as mentioned earlier, the children have never been diagnosed as deaf, and of course, negative attitudes and ignorance legitimize disabuse. Ignorance about deafness, ignorance that it's a communication challenge, ignorance about how to address communication practice, how to support the acquisition of language and the development of communication skills, kind of legitimize disabuse. And quite frankly, the experience of deaf children, as we've seen, is that global child protection frameworks have failed deaf children. They are not inclusive of the needs of deaf children. They don't understand how to recognize, communicate, work with, or engage deaf children. The parents of deaf children, who are invariably hearing, and the wider deaf community. But let's have a little think about how we can address that challenge just going forward. So a few words on, just pull it back a bit, on DeafKidz International. We work to respond to the safeguarding and protection needs of deaf children and young people. We look to ensure deaf children and young people are able to live safely without fear of abuse and exploitation. And we're a total communication organisation with safeguarding at the heart of what we do. So by total communication, what we mean is sign language, sign-supported spoken language. So like now I'm speaking with my voice, but I'm also using sign language. That's called SSE in the UK, sign-supported English. So you have sign language, no voice, sign-supported spoken language, oral method, clear, orally articulated speech, and hearing aids. So at DeafKidz, we use everything, whatever it takes to communicate with the child, their family, their network. So a total communication. And we're also deaf-led, looking to resource deaf children to safely access protection, communication, and education in the communication mode of choice, whether it be, as mentioned, sign language, sign-supported spoken language, oral method, or more. So key to our work as well is that we're deaf-led. The reason I came to set up DeafKidz was because I, as a deaf man, could see that there was no dedicated and specific child protection organisation working to respond to the particular communication needs of deaf children and to address the particular risk and vulnerabilities they were experiencing. Because if you go back to what we have seen with deaf children through our work, the high level of abuse, it's actually not difficult to see why that risk and vulnerability occurs. Because if it's a deaf child, you've never been diagnosed as deaf, you therefore don't go to school because there's something wrong with you, but we don't know what, and you clearly can't go to school. And if you can't acquire language, speech, with which to articulate, with which to communicate, you therefore, A, don't know what's happening with you because you don't have the language or the vocabulary, or B, you can't say, stop, don't do that, because again, you don't have that language, you don't have that vocabulary. And so, the incidence of deafness, the high incidence of abuse of deaf children and young people occurs because deaf children simply cannot self-advocate, self-represent and say, stop that. No. And so that is the reason DeafKidz came into being as a deaf-led organisation, a group of deaf professionals saying, we have to do something about this because clearly nobody else is. And part of our role is to work with your good selves, like conference today, to say, what can we do collectively to ensure your work is inclusive of the needs of deaf children? Notwithstanding setting the scene, as we've done just earlier, about the global incidence of disability, how does your work actually include deaf and disabled children? Because the reasonable adjustments that you make for deaf children can all equally apply to disabled children. So, what is our response then at DeafKidz? Well, we work to prevent and mitigate the abuse of deaf children and young people. We look to reduce risk and vulnerability by removing barriers to communication. So that is by, as you've seen here, police officers that are perhaps working in the response pathway to deaf victims of abuse is ensuring that that criminal justice capability is able to access qualified sign language interpreters, so that when the interview takes place or evidence has been secured, that information is accurately acquired. So you're removing a barrier to communication because you're bringing in a sign language interpreter, or you're providing information in a clear, succinct way, so that with limited literacy, because invariably the deaf child hasn't accessed school or formal education, you can at least explain what's going on. Our work looks to ensure deaf children have equal access to health, education, and economic opportunity, and of course, support deaf-led local advocacy. So certainly in South Africa, Kenya, Pakistan, and India, countries that we work in, we work with the local deaf community and deaf organizations to say, look, you have a responsibility too to ensure your children are safe from abuse and exploitation. So let's work with your nation state government, your Ministry of Justice, your Ministry of Children, or whatever, and say, look, your legislation, your protection practices must be inclusive of deaf children. So if they're not, let's advocate to make sure that that happens. And finally, we work to partners such as yourselves and those organizations that are here today to ensure that child protection frameworks and capacities are inclusive of the needs of deaf children. So we've got some incredible people attending the conference today, some incredible organizations. You know, how is your work inclusive? What adjustments are you making to ensure that a deaf child who might have limited language can access your provision? Do you have sign language interpretation on your resources? Or if you were having a meeting or a briefing, how would you reach out to the deaf community to ensure that those working with deaf children are able to attend? And indeed, how would you engage with deaf children yourselves and say, what is your experience? How can we make sure that our work is relevant and empowering, relevant and appropriate to you? So, having set the scene around the global incidence of disability, having looked at the DeafKidz experience, why are deaf children particularly vulnerable to online abuse? And by that, we mean cyberbullying, sexing, grooming, to invariably conduct a sexual act online. There are a number of reasons. Poverty, extensive time spent online, lack of education and awareness, loneliness, an inability to disclose abuse, and the failure of existing online protection initiatives to be inclusive. So let's have a look at those in some detail. So, deaf children and their families are often the most poorest and neglected. Poor maternal health has perhaps led to the deafness occurring. The child and then the family is marginalized. So in families fractured by the need to survive, and that could be in the UK, in some of the inner city areas in the UK or the US, South America, Europe, anywhere. If you're facing poverty, if your family is driven by the need to find money, then placing a child online to perform a sex act for somebody who's on the other side of the world and is prepared to pay for it is a means to an end. So poverty is a particular driver. Disability, deafness leads to poverty. And certainly, in the life cycle of the deaf child, young person, and adult, if you don't have language, if you're not able to access education, then getting gainful employment through which you can sustain yourself is difficult. But here, right at the beginning, deaf children, in an impoverished situation, will be put online in order to make money. Spent extensive time online. So, the hearing parents of a deaf child, traumatized because they haven't had the perfect child, struggling to communicate with their child, don't know what to do, stressed because they're having to look after a deaf child and perhaps their other children, and also perhaps having to address the challenge of the deaf child having other complex needs, because what does tend to happen is that you find deafness linked with other disabilities. And of course, that's particularly challenging, particularly difficult. So if the child has, and also maybe exhibit challenging behaviour, and that occurs certainly in our experience as a result of frustration. So let's dial back a bit. If you haven't acquired language, if you don't know how to communicate, if your parents aren't engaging with you, how do you react to that? You punch, you scream, you tantrum, challenging behaviour. So, an exhausted parent, a caregiver with a deaf child, possibly with additional disabilities, possibly exhibiting challenging behaviour, boom, push them online, leave them with that machine, uh, where obviously that child will roam online and be prey to those seeking to access children. Lack of education and awareness, and we've mentioned this a couple of times. Deaf children are often denied access to education because they're deemed incapable of learning or because they're not worthy of schooling, denied access to life skills and invariably sex education. They will not actually realise they're viewing harmful material or that they're being groomed or ultimately and horrifically so live streamed. This is both complemented and it's compounded by the stigma that's around disability, deafness, and sex. Like, in the sense that some parents may not wish their child to access sex education because the thought of, their child having sex as a young person, deaf young people have sex? No, surely not. Um, you know, more deaf people, we can't have that. And believe you me, that attitude does occasionally prevail. We have certainly seen it. And so, because again, yes, I mean, there's a fear that access to that education will increase sexuality or enhance sexuality and lead to increased sexual behavior. So, a lack of awareness, lack of education, and indeed an ignorance as to what constitutes abuse leads deaf children to be particularly vulnerable to online abuse. Don't quite know what you're looking at. Uh, I don't quite know what I'm being asked to do, um, but you do it because you're spending so much time online, because that's the only way you can perhaps access a space, the wider world, because nobody else is supporting you, facilitating you, or loving you. Loneliness, um, shunned by their hearing peers, seen as different, seen as other. Um, Deaf children live lonely lives and online, desperate to be liked, loved, to be part of something, to be normal, whatever that means, they'll go online. Crave, especially, exhibiting low esteem, craving attention, willing to please. Uh, our evidence, our experience is that deaf children will readily respond to those that show an interest in them and through social media or other means. So loneliness is a particular factor into which makes deaf children vulnerable and susceptible to online abuse. There is then, an inability to disclose abuse. If you don't actually know what's happening to you, and you don't know but are uncomfortable with it, but you don't have the vocabulary, the language, how do you disclose it? In perhaps the limited communication within the family, how does it say this online? Someone asked me to do this, or this. So there's that inability to disclose, to get help. And finally, deaf children are vulnerable because there's a failure of existing online initiatives to be inclusive. You know, And that's why, today is particularly interested in reaching out to conference to say, how is your work inclusive? How can we ensure that your initiatives designed at reducing the risk and susceptibility of children to online abuse. How can it be inclusive, and what do we need to do that? I guess one challenging point to note is that there are actually a number of sites seeking to perpetrate the online abuse of deaf and disabled children. And again, we have evidence in the DeafKidz International world that some targets seek to commercially exploit deaf and disabled children, and that there is a there is a commercial marketplace for that material. And indeed, there was a high-profile case in the UK, I think earlier this year, of a celebrity whose name I won't disclose. Her son was disabled, and his image had been corrupted and placed online in various compromising sexual positions with other material of disabled children. So certainly there was a commercial market for this material. And regrettably, some of this material is perpetrated by adults within the deaf and disability community. And one instance again in the UK has been of Nick Sturley, who's on the slide there, who lived with sight loss and deafness, deafblind, as a result of Usher syndrome. A particularly well-known character within the UK deaf community, was found to have a huge amount of indecent images of children of the most depraved kind. Some that he engineered, some which were taken in a studio he had set up, and other material which he had traded off from other adults wishing to access material. And, indeed, some of the content was from deaf children, young people that he had groomed. So, regrettably, there are deaf and disabled adults who also, seek to access this material. And of course, the challenge for the authorities is how do you challenge the perpetrator? How do you address the acts that they have committed? And certainly UK police dealing with Nick Sturley were in a difficult position. They had to book in interpreters. They had to use various means to communicate with this individual using hands-on sign language to find out, why he was doing this and the extent of his acts, and therefore, the reach of his victims. And so that's particularly concerning. And deaf children or adults that are aware of this material, as mentioned previously, may not know how to report a site because of poor literacy, lack of language, a lack of confidence. So, having looked at why deaf children are vulnerable online, just flagging up the point that regrettably some sites look to perpetrate this abuse. There's a particular market for it, incredibly so. At DeafKidz, what we've worked to do is develop a capacity called DeafKidz Defenders, which looks at using game capabilities to empower deaf children to be safe online. And we've trialed this in South Africa and Pakistan. And it's essentially comprises of 7 games construct, which looks at subjects such as private parts, what's private, what's yours, through to online grooming and cyberbullying, and what to do should you believe that you are being groomed, and how do you reduce your risk to cyberbullying, and how should you respond. The way the Defenders program has been built is deaf children can become superheroes, like the defender seen there on the image. They can construct that character as they wish, male, female, non-binary, sign language user, hearing aid user, whatever, and you play through the games, you acquire points, you become the defender. This program's been extensively funded by Safe Online, which many of you will know, and of course the Oak Foundation in Geneva. We are now looking to scale this globally, and indeed in the coming months we are scaling within South Africa, Pakistan, and into Kenya, and thereafter, as said, globally. And what's been particularly pleasing to note is that deaf children respond to the imagery, they retain the information, their behaviours change, and they're empowered and resourced to tell a trusted adult should they experience untoward behaviour or something that concerns them, and in particular, they're resourced and empowered to report sites that or individuals that may be seeking to access them. So that's an initiative that we've undertaken at DeafKidz Defenders, been hugely successful, and certainly if conference attendees are interested, we can send you more information on that. And indeed, if you would like to partner with us, we're particularly keen to cascade across the US, then that's a conversation that perhaps we could have. DeafKidz Defenders USA. Got to do it, haven't we? So, in terms of child protection practitioners, your good selves working in online abuse and exploitation, how do we reduce risk and vulnerability of deaf children? And I think, within your own work, I guess that there's a number of things we can look at, and that is, empowering deaf children and young people to recognise online abuse. So within your own particular strategies, programming, the implementation of the products that you have, actually, how can we empower deaf children within them? So, what can we do to ensure our work includes the needs of these children? And so therefore, how can we collectively, as a movement, empower deaf children to recognise abuse? How do we ensure governments, civil society decision makers, child protection practitioners are able to safeguard and protect? And in particular, how are we able to respond to the clinical, social welfare and criminal justice needs of deaf survivors of online abuse? So perhaps through work that we've done, a deaf child discloses, they have been abused. How do we address with any clinical, like mental health needs that have resulted in experience? What about social welfare, ensuring the child and their family are safe, and also criminal justice? How do we track down the perpetrator, ensure that the evidence is assembled with which to persecute that individual? So, how do we do that? I think we can reduce risk and vulnerability through our work by engaging with the deaf community to ensure programming has an authentic and robust input. So people attending today are drawn from all over the globe. In your own nation states, you will have organizations for the deaf, you will have deaf representative organizations. Are you talking to them? Are you engaging with that community? Say, hey, how can our program be accessible to you and your networks? And so again, as per the following point, can we add captions, accessible language, sign language interpreted explanations, whatever? And furthermore, can we use positive deaf role models from whom safe behaviours are relayed? In the UK, we have a number of deaf celebrities, role models, and we certainly seek to enrol those individuals to support what we're doing. And it's interesting today in the UK, in the corner of your screens, as in many of your countries, you've got the sign language interpreter. Sign language is recognised as an official language. Provision can be good. That in some geographies, as we've seen at DeafKidz, if you're a sign language user, your hands get dramatically amputated because it's voodoo, or you are set on fire, or you are raped. So, there's this division, isn't there, of experience. In some geographies, everybody wants to learn sign language, all the courses are full. There's a positive approach to deaf culture, deaf experience. Yet in others, as we've been saying all afternoon, there's stigma, discrimination, and abuse. But in looking to challenge that, the use of deaf role models to which safe behaviours are relayed is something that we found works well. And lastly, deaf awareness training for those working in child protection and victim response. And indeed, that could be you. Have you booked in deaf awareness training? Has your team ever had that? Would you know where to get it? So, in terms of reducing the risk and vulnerability of deaf children online, it's about your programming, how, ensuring your program includes the needs of deaf children, that you make those adaptations so that deaf children can access your content or your programming, that you bring in deaf role models to demonstrate a positive approach to deaf inclusion, and that you're deaf aware, that you have deaf awareness training and sensitization so that, again, within your organization, that's there. Coming to the end of the session, I believe, and I thought this was interactive, but I've done all the talking. Sorry about that. I think the challenge for the conference today is, how do you ensure your programming is inclusive? Do you have the confidence to reach out to the deaf community where you're working and where you're operating? For example, how do you book sign language interpreters? Would you know how to do that? And also, how will you ensure reasonable adjustments are built into your program design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation? And indeed, is that monitoring and evaluation, if you're able to say to investors, donors, look, we had a number of deaf children access our provision, then surely that will promote and enthuse donors to support your work further, because you're responding to the requirements of the SDGs, the UN Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities, the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, to be inclusive. And I guess a global point at the end of this is, if you're making reasonable adjustments to deaf children, you could also make them for other disabilities as well. And that will surely go a long way to ensuring that we, as a child protection community, respond to the protection needs of a community that are most definitely marginalised, disenfranchised, and at risk for all the reasons we've just been describing. I hope this rough, fast session has been of interest. I hope it gives you food for thought. I hope it's the beginning of a discussion. I'd like to think that DeafKidz International could continue to talk to you and work with you to look at how we can make your programming inclusive, and how we can work together to build a powerhouse that protects deaf children and more. Very happy to take any questions or to respond to any points to note that you may wish to table. Thank you.
Steve, thank you so much for that very detailed and very comprehensive presentation.